February 19, 2020, began like any other school morning in suburban Australia. The streets of Camp Hill, Brisbane were quiet. Lawns freshly cut. Cars warming in driveways. Children preparing for another ordinary day. Nothing about that morning suggested it would soon become one of the most horrifying domestic violence crimes the country had ever witnessed. Inside a family car, a mother was driving her 3 children to school. 6-year-old Arlia, 4-year-old Liana, 3-year-old Trey. Their mother, Hannah Clarke, was trying to rebuild her life after leaving a troubled marriage, hopeful, determined, and focused on protecting her children. But just minutes into that routine school run, everything changed. On a quiet suburban street, in full daylight, an ambush unfolded. Witnesses would later describe screams, flames, and an act of violence so shocking that seasoned emergency responders struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Petrol had been poured inside the vehicle. The car was deliberately set on fire. Neighbors ran toward the chaos. Strangers tried desperately to help. Sirens filled the air. And somehow, through unimaginable pain, Hannah Clarke managed to escape the burning car long enough to tell first responders exactly who had done this to her and her children. Within hours, the story spread across Australia. A nation watched in disbelief as the details emerged. This was not random, not sudden, and not without warning. What happened that morning would ignite a national reckoning about domestic violence, coercive control, and the hidden dangers that can exist behind ordinary suburban doors. Because the most disturbing part of this case is that many of the warning signs were already there. This is the story of Hannah Clarke, and the tragedy that forced an entire country to ask one devastating question. Could this have been prevented? In the hours following the attack, police closed off a quiet street in Brisbane's inner suburbs. Crime tape stretched across Logan Road as investigators began piecing together what had happened. Residents stood silently outside their homes, many still unable to understand how such violence could unfold in the middle of an ordinary weekday morning. The victims were quickly identified: 31-year-old Hannah Clarke and her 3 children. Within a single day, their names would be known across Australia, not because of who they were in life, but because of the unimaginable way their lives ended. Hannah Clarke was described by friends and family as energetic, compassionate, and deeply devoted to her children. She worked as a fitness instructor in Brisbane, building a community around health, encouragement, and resilience. To many who knew her, she represented strength, a young mother focused on creating stability and happiness for her family. Photos later shared publicly showed school events, birthday celebrations, and everyday moments that reflected a life centered around motherhood. But behind those ordinary moments was a relationship that had been slowly breaking down. Police soon confirmed that the attack was not random. The man responsible was Hannah's estranged husband, 31-year-old Rowan Baxter. Baxter was a former rugby league player who had once lived and worked overseas. Publicly, he appeared charismatic and disciplined, a fitness professional who, like Hannah, worked in the health industry. Together, the couple had operated a fitness business and raised their young family. From the outside, their lives appeared successful and stable. But investigators would later reveal a far more complicated reality. By early 2020, Hannah and Rowan were no longer living together. The couple had separated months before the attack. Hannah had moved with the children into a new home, attempting to establish independence and safety after the breakdown of their marriage. According to statements later examined during official investigations, the separation period had been marked by tension, emotional conflict, and ongoing disputes surrounding custody arrangements. Like many families navigating separation, they were attempting to create a new routine, one structured around shared parenting agreements and legal processes. In Australia, family separation is recognized by experts as one of the most dangerous periods in cases involving domestic violence. Authorities would later emphasize that risk often increases when one partner attempts to leave or regain independence. And in the months leading up to February 2020, concerns about Hannah's safety had already begun to surface among those close to her. Friends later told media outlets that Hannah had expressed fear about her former partner's behavior. Reports described patterns of controlling conduct, including persistent communication, monitoring movements, and emotional pressure. These patterns would later become central to understanding what investigators described as coercive control. At the time, however, many of these behaviors remained largely invisible to the wider public. As police gathered evidence, a timeline began to emerge. The attack was not an impulsive act committed in a moment of rage. Instead, authorities believed it was planned. Petrol had been obtained in advance. The confrontation occurred at a predictable point in Hannah's daily routine, the morning school run. Investigators concluded that the offender had waited for the opportunity. The brutality of the crime shocked even experienced detectives. But equally disturbing was what followed in the national conversation. Early media reports initially described the incident using familiar phrases: domestic dispute and family tragedy. Advocacy groups quickly challenged that language, arguing it minimized the deliberate nature of the violence. Within days, the framing shifted. Officials and journalists began referring to the event more accurately as a domestic violence homicide. As Australia mourned, thousands gathered at vigils across the country. Flowers covered public spaces. Messages written by strangers expressed grief, anger, and confusion. Many people asked the same question: how could such an extreme act occur despite modern legal systems, policing, and awareness campaigns? That question would soon lead investigators beyond the events of a single morning, and into the deeper history of the relationship itself. Because to understand what happened on February 19th, investigators first needed to understand everything that came before it. Over the following months, a formal coronial investigation would examine not only the attack, but every interaction between the family and public institutions leading up to it. Police reports, court processes, witness statements, warning signs. The goal was not simply to explain how 4 lives were lost, but to determine whether the tragedy revealed failures that could be prevented in the future. And as evidence emerged, the case began transforming from a single criminal act into a national turning point. The story of Hannah Clarke was no longer only about one family. It became a story about patterns of control that often remain hidden, systems struggling to recognize escalating danger, and the difficult question of when warning signs become emergencies. Before the flames, before the sirens, before the nation knew her name, there was a relationship slowly unraveling behind closed doors. And that is where this story truly begins. Long before the attack shocked Australia, the story of Hannah Clarke and Rowan Baxter began like many relationships do, with promise, ambition, and shared plans for the future. The two met as young adults drawn together by sport, fitness, and an active lifestyle. Both were deeply involved in the fitness industry, building careers around physical training and motivation. Friends described the early years of their relationship as energetic and optimistic. Together, they would eventually marry and start a family, welcoming 3 children over the following years. To outsiders, their life appeared busy but successful, shaped by work, parenting, and the everyday challenges of raising young children. During this period, Rowan Baxter's background as a former rugby league player contributed to a public image built around discipline and strength. The couple later operated a fitness business together, working closely both professionally and personally. Social media posts and public photographs showed family outings, training sessions, and moments that suggested stability. But according to evidence later examined during official investigations, tensions within the relationship were developing behind the scenes. Friends and family would later describe gradual changes, not sudden violence, but patterns of behavior that evolved over time. These patterns included jealousy, emotional pressure, and increasing control over aspects of daily life. Experts in domestic violence would later identify many of these behaviors as indicators of coercive control, a form of abuse centered not on isolated incidents, but on domination and restriction. Unlike physical violence, coercive control often leaves few visible signs. It can appear as constant monitoring, controlling finances, limiting independence, or creating fear through intimidation rather than assault. During the coronial investigation that followed the murders, evidence suggested that Hannah's independence gradually became a source of conflict within the relationship. As responsibilities grew and pressures increased, disagreements intensified. Those close to Hannah later said she began confiding concerns about the relationship's emotional strain. Still, like many couples facing difficulties, the problems remained largely private. Over time, Hannah increasingly focused on protecting her children's well-being and establishing stability at home. Public reporting indicates that she began considering separation after ongoing conflict and controlling behavior became difficult to manage. Leaving a long-term relationship, particularly one involving young children, is rarely a single decision. It is often a process, slow, uncertain, and emotionally complex. Eventually, Hannah made the decision to separate. She moved with the children into a different residence in Brisbane, beginning the challenging transition into life as a single parent. Separation marked a turning point, not only emotionally, but legally. Parenting arrangements now required negotiation, communication, and structured agreements between two people whose relationship had broken down. According to information later reviewed by investigators, contact between Hannah and Rowan continued after the separation due to shared custody arrangements. Exchanges involving the children required regular interaction. For many separated families, these moments can be difficult but manageable. In this case, however, tensions did not ease. Friends later reported that Hannah expressed increasing anxiety during this period. She allegedly received persistent messages and unwanted communication. Concerns about controlling behavior did not disappear with separation. Instead, they appeared to intensify. Domestic violence specialists often describe separation as the moment when control is perceived to be lost, creating heightened risk. This pattern would later become central to understanding the events that followed. Despite these challenges, Hannah continued building a new routine for her children. School drop-offs, activities, and daily structure became anchors of normal life. Those who knew her described determination, a focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on conflict. She remained active professionally and socially, maintaining connections within her community. Behind the scenes, however, legal and emotional pressures were ongoing. Parenting negotiations, communication disputes, and the emotional strain of separation formed a backdrop that investigators would later examine closely. Each interaction added context to what authorities would ultimately describe as an escalating situation. Importantly, there had been no public indication that violence on such an extreme scale was imminent. Like many domestic violence cases, the danger was not obvious to outsiders. Neighbors saw a quiet street. Friends saw a devoted mother rebuilding her life. The warning signs existed, but they were fragmented, private, and easy to underestimate. In the months before February 2020, Hannah was working toward independence, emotionally, financially, and physically. She was planning for the future of her children. What she could not know was that investigators would later conclude the situation had entered its most dangerous phase. Evidence reviewed after the tragedy suggested preparation had begun before the attack itself. Authorities later confirmed petrol had been obtained prior to the incident. The offender appeared to know Hannah's routine, particularly the predictable morning school run. Routine, something normally associated with safety and stability, would instead become vulnerability. Domestic violence researchers frequently describe escalation as a process rather than an event. Small behaviors accumulate. Boundaries are tested. Control increases gradually. By the time danger becomes visible, the pattern may already be deeply entrenched. As February approached, Hannah continued focusing on normal life for her children. School mornings followed familiar rhythms: breakfast, backpacks, and short drives through suburban streets. Moments that felt ordinary, predictable, safe. Yet investigators would later determine that someone else was watching those routines closely. The tragedy that unfolded on February 19th did not begin with flames or sirens. It began months, perhaps years, earlier, through patterns that slowly reshaped a relationship behind closed doors. Understanding those patterns would become essential not only to explaining the crime, but to understanding why it resonated so deeply across Australia. Because the question facing investigators was no longer simply what happened. The question had become far more difficult. When did the danger truly begin? To answer that question, investigators would next reconstruct the final days leading up to the attack, a timeline that would reveal how routine, preparation, and opportunity converged on one devastating morning. The morning of February 19th, 2020 began quietly in Brisbane's eastern suburbs. The sun had already risen over Camp Hill. Traffic moved steadily through residential streets as parents prepared for work and children prepared for school. For Hannah Clarke, the morning followed a familiar routine, one she had repeated countless times before. Breakfast prepared. School bags packed. 3 young children settled into the car for the short drive ahead. 6-year-old Aliyah sat inside the vehicle alongside her younger siblings, 4-year-old Liana and 3-year-old Trey. It was an ordinary school run, predictable, structured, and comforting in its normality. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. But investigators would later determine that someone else already knew exactly where Hannah would be that morning. According to police findings, Rowan Baxter had positioned himself along Hannah's route. Evidence later indicated preparation before the attack, including the purchase and possession of petrol. Authorities concluded the confrontation was deliberate, timed to intercept Hannah during her daily routine. At approximately 8:20 in the morning, Hannah's vehicle stopped along Logan Road. What happened next unfolded rapidly. Baxter approached the car. Witnesses later reported seeing him force his way inside the vehicle. Within moments, petrol was poured throughout the interior. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. Seconds later, the vehicle was ignited. Flames engulfed the car in full view of passing motorists and nearby residents. Thick smoke rose into the air as screams echoed through the street. Neighbors rushed outside their homes. Drivers abandoned their vehicles. Several witnesses attempted to intervene despite the intensity of the fire. Emergency services were called immediately as bystanders tried desperately to help those trapped inside. Amid the chaos, Hannah Clarke managed to escape the burning vehicle. Severely injured, she stumbled onto the roadway seeking help. According to first responders and witness reports later presented publicly, she identified her attacker before collapsing from catastrophic burns. Her actions provided investigators with immediate clarity about what had occurred. Inside the vehicle, the fire intensified rapidly. Despite the efforts of witnesses and emergency crews, the conditions made rescue impossible. The 3 children died at the scene. The violence of the act shocked even experienced emergency personnel, many of whom later described the incident as unlike anything they had previously encountered. Rowan Baxter was found nearby with critical injuries consistent with self-inflicted wounds. He died at the scene shortly after emergency services arrived. Authorities would later confirm there was no ongoing threat to the public. The attack had been targeted and contained within minutes, but its consequences would reverberate nationwide. Hannah Clarke was transported to hospital in critical condition. Medical teams worked to save her life, but the severity of her injuries proved overwhelming. She died later that evening. Within hours, 4 lives had been lost. As investigators secured the area, Logan Road transformed from an ordinary suburban street into an active crime scene. Forensic officers documented evidence. Detectives interviewed witnesses who struggled to describe what they had seen. Many spoke of disbelief, the difficulty of reconciling such violence with the quiet neighborhood surrounding them. News of the attack spread rapidly across Australia. Initial reports described a car fire involving a family. But as police confirmed the identities and circumstances, the scale of the tragedy became clear. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of domestic violence carried out in public daylight. Throughout the day, tributes began appearing near the scene. Flowers lined the roadside. Handwritten notes expressed grief from strangers who had never met the family but felt connected to the loss. The location quickly became a place of mourning. For investigators, however, the work had only begun. Detectives needed to reconstruct every minute leading up to the attack: movements, communications, and planning. Surveillance footage, witness timelines, and forensic evidence were collected to understand how the events unfolded so precisely. The emerging picture suggested calculation rather than spontaneity. The attack occurred at a predictable time. The offender appeared to know Hannah's routine. Preparation indicated intent well before that morning began. As details became public, the emotional impact deepened. Australians watched news coverage showing a suburban street transformed by tragedy, a reminder that domestic violence does not always occur behind closed doors. Sometimes, it erupts into public view without warning. Experts would later emphasize that the attack reflected a pattern seen in high-risk domestic violence cases worldwide, violence escalating after separation. The crime forced authorities and the public alike to confront uncomfortable realities about how danger develops and how difficult it can be to recognize escalation before it reaches its most extreme outcome. By nightfall, vigils were already being planned. Political leaders issued statements of grief and condemnation. Advocacy organizations called for deeper examination into domestic violence prevention. The tragedy had moved beyond a single investigation. It had become a national moment of reckoning. Yet for detectives working the case, one question remained central. How had the situation progressed from separation to lethal violence? To answer that, investigators would begin examining the history of interactions between the family and public systems, police reports, legal processes, and warning signs that existed before the attack. The flames that morning lasted only minutes, but the investigation they ignited would continue for years. Because understanding the crime itself was only the first step. The next challenge was understanding everything that allowed it to happen. In the hours after the attack, investigators faced a scene that was both emotionally devastating and legally complex. The offender was dead. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, and no criminal trial. That reality meant the investigation would serve a different purpose. Not prosecution, but understanding. Detectives from the Queensland Police Service began reconstructing the events of February 19 minute by minute. The first stage focused on evidence gathered at the scene itself. Forensic specialists examined the burned vehicle, surrounding roadway, and items recovered nearby. Witness statements were collected from residents, passing drivers, and first responders who had arrived within moments of the attack. Many witnesses described the same sequence: a sudden confrontation, flames erupting rapidly, and desperate attempts to intervene. Their accounts helped investigators confirm the timeline and establish that the attack had been deliberate and targeted. Almost immediately, police turned their attention toward the history of the relationship between Hannah Clarke and Rowan Baxter. Officers reviewed prior interactions involving the couple, including reports, complaints, and any documented concerns. What they were searching for was context, signs that might explain how the situation had escalated to lethal violence. Detectives analyzed phone records, electronic communications, and digital evidence. Messages exchanged during the months leading up to the attack revealed ongoing conflict following the separation. Investigators sought to understand patterns of communication, frequency of contact, and emotional tone, all factors used to assess behavioral escalation in domestic violence cases. As information emerged, authorities publicly confirmed that the incident fell within the category of domestic and family violence. This classification shifted the national conversation. The tragedy was no longer framed as an isolated act, but as part of a broader social issue affecting communities across Australia. Because the offender had died, responsibility for examining the case moved beyond traditional criminal investigation. In Queensland, deaths occurring under violent or unusual circumstances are reviewed through a coronial inquest. The role of the coroner is not to assign criminal guilt, but to establish facts, identify contributing factors, and recommend measures that could prevent similar tragedies. The Queensland coroner's investigation began gathering extensive evidence. Police documentation, court records, medical information, statements from family members, friends, and professionals who had interacted with the couple. Each piece contributed to a broader reconstruction of events leading up to the attack. Central to the inquiry was the concept of coercive control. Experts explained that domestic violence does not always begin with physical assault. Instead, it often develops through patterns of dominance, controlling finances, limiting independence, monitoring behavior, and creating psychological fear. Evidence presented during the inquest suggested these patterns had been present in the relationship prior to separation. Investigators examined whether warning signs had been visible to institutions responsible for protecting vulnerable individuals. This included reviewing how risk assessments were conducted and whether existing systems adequately recognized escalating danger. The inquiry also explored the period after Hannah left the relationship, a time experts identify as particularly high risk. Research presented during proceedings indicated that separation can increase the likelihood of severe violence when an abusive partner perceives loss of control. Police interactions prior to the incident were carefully reviewed. The goal was not blame, but learning. Could risk have been assessed differently? Were there opportunities for earlier intervention? Were existing laws sufficient to address coercive control before violence occurred? As hearings progressed, the case drew national attention. Media organizations reported daily developments, and advocacy groups closely followed the proceedings. For many Australians, the investigation represented more than fact-finding. It represented a search for accountability within systems designed to protect families. Evidence revealed how complex domestic violence cases can be for authorities. Many behaviors described during the inquiry were legal in isolation but concerning when viewed collectively. This raised difficult questions about how institutions identify danger before it becomes visible as physical violence. Experts testified that coercive control often operates gradually, making it difficult for outsiders to recognize severity. Victims themselves may attempt to manage the situation privately while seeking stability for their children. By the time risk becomes undeniable, intervention options may already be limited. The coroner's investigation ultimately sought to answer a critical question: not only how the crime occurred, but whether systemic change could reduce the likelihood of similar tragedies. Public hearings highlighted gaps in awareness surrounding non-physical forms of abuse. Discussions emerged about whether Australian law should better recognise coercive control as a serious indicator of risk. Policymakers, legal experts, and advocacy organisations began debating reforms influenced directly by the findings of the case. Throughout the investigation, Hannah Clarke's final actions remained central. Her identification of the attacker provided immediate clarity for authorities and ensured the circumstances were understood from the earliest moments. Investigators acknowledged that this evidence allowed the inquiry to focus quickly on prevention rather than uncertainty. As months passed, the tragedy continued reshaping public understanding of domestic violence. Community discussions expanded beyond grief toward prevention, education, and systemic responsibility. The investigation had transformed a single criminal act into a catalyst for national reflection. Eventually, the coronial findings would outline recommendations aimed at improving risk assessment, interagency communication, and awareness of coercive control dynamics. These recommendations were not punishments, they were lessons drawn from loss. By the time the investigative phase concluded, one truth had become unavoidable. The attack on February 19th was not an isolated moment of violence. It was the final stage of a progression investigators now understood far more clearly than before. And as the nation absorbed those findings, attention turned toward the broader consequences. How the tragedy would influence law, policy, and public awareness in the years that followed. Because the investigation had uncovered answers. But those answers raised an even larger question. What must change so that history does not repeat itself? The evidence presented during the inquiry revealed patterns that experts recognized immediately, but that much of the public had never fully understood before. The turning point came not from a single discovery, but from a gradual realization. Investigators concluded that the attack followed a trajectory commonly seen in high-risk domestic violence cases. The separation of a partner, the perceived loss of control, escalating behavior, and finally, lethal violence. Testimony presented during the inquest emphasized the role of coercive control, a pattern of domination that often exists without visible injuries. Experts explained how control can manifest through surveillance, emotional pressure, financial restriction, and intimidation. These behaviors, while deeply harmful, are often misunderstood or minimized because they do not always meet traditional definitions of violence. For many Australians following the hearings, this marked a profound shift in understanding. The tragedy was no longer viewed solely through the lens of a single morning's events. Instead, it became a case study in how danger can develop slowly, quietly, and largely unseen. Public discussion intensified as details from the inquiry reached national media. Advocacy groups argued that the case exposed gaps in how society recognizes and responds to domestic abuse before it escalates. The phrase coercive control entered mainstream conversation, appearing in news broadcasts, political debates, and community forums across the country. Government leaders publicly acknowledged the significance of the case. Statements described the deaths of Hannah Clarke and her children as a watershed moment for Australia's approach to domestic and family violence. Calls for reform grew louder, not only from activists, but from legal experts, law enforcement professionals, and members of the public. The coronial findings highlighted how risk assessment in domestic violence situations can be extraordinarily difficult. Individual incidents may appear manageable when viewed separately, but when combined, they can reveal escalation toward extreme danger. Recognizing that pattern early became one of the central lessons of the investigation. The inquiry also examined systemic challenges faced by police and support services. Authorities must balance legal thresholds, limited information, and competing responsibilities, often making decisions based on incomplete understanding of private relationships. The case demonstrated how even experienced institutions can struggle to identify the full level of risk before tragedy occurs. As findings were released publicly, community reactions shifted from grief toward reflection. Australians began asking difficult questions about prevention, accountability, and cultural attitudes toward domestic violence. Vigils held months earlier took on new meaning. They were no longer only memorials, they became calls for change. Media coverage increasingly focused on education and awareness. Survivors of domestic abuse shared personal stories mirroring elements identified during the inquiry. Patterns once dismissed as relationship conflict were now being recognized as potential warning signs. The turning point extended beyond public perception into legislative discussion. Policymakers debated whether laws should more clearly recognize coercive control as a form of domestic violence. Several Australian states began examining reforms influenced directly by lessons drawn from the case. Experts emphasized that preventing domestic violence requires early recognition, long before physical harm occurs. Education, coordinated services, and improved communication between agencies were identified as essential components of prevention. Throughout these discussions, the focus repeatedly returned to Hannah Clarke and her children. Their deaths had forced a national. At a private funeral in Brisbane, family and friends said goodbye. White coffins stood before mourners. Speakers remembered laughter, school mornings, and ordinary moments suddenly transformed into memories. Hannah's parents described their daughter as strong and loving, a mother who taught her children confidence and kindness. Outside, crowds gathered quietly, many unable to enter but unwilling to stay away. Australia was grieving people most had never met. In the months that followed, the case reshaped national conversation around domestic violence. Advocates pushed for recognition of coercive control as a serious criminal behavior, not merely relationship conflict. Policy discussions accelerated. Training reforms were introduced within Queensland Police. Public education campaigns expanded. And Hannah's parents established the Small Steps for Hannah Foundation, working to educate young people about respectful relationships and early warning signs of abuse. Their advocacy contributed to legislative reform efforts, including moves toward criminalizing coercive control in Queensland. Grief became action. Loss became purpose. The physical crime scene eventually disappeared. Roads reopened. Grass regrew. But the impact remained. Memorial spaces were created in Brisbane, transforming sites of tragedy into places of reflection and remembrance. For many Australians, the case permanently changed how domestic violence was understood, not as isolated incidents, but as escalating patterns that can end in fatal violence. Experts described it as a national turning point, a moment when private suffering became impossible to ignore. Today, Hannah Clarke's name is spoken not only in grief, but in warning. Her story is taught in schools, discussed in policing reforms, referenced in conversations about coercive control across Australia. Her parents continue advocacy work, determined that awareness might save others. Because the aftermath of violence is not measured only in loss, but in whether the living choose to learn from it. For years, advocates argued that domestic violence laws focus too heavily on physical injury. But Hannah Clarke's case exposed something deeper. A pattern of psychological domination that had existed long before the final act of violence. Public pressure grew. Experts testified. Families spoke publicly about warning signs that had once gone unnoticed. And eventually, legislation changed. In March 2024, Queensland passed landmark reforms criminalising coercive control, legislation widely known as Hannah's Law. For the first time, patterns of intimidation, surveillance, isolation, and emotional abuse could be prosecuted as crimes in their own right. The law officially came into force in 2025, carrying penalties of up to 14 years imprisonment for offenders. A concept once misunderstood became legally recognized. The change marked a turning point in how domestic violence was defined, not as isolated incidents, but as ongoing systems of control. The impact spread beyond legislation. Police training programs were reviewed. Domestic violence risk assessments evolved. Public campaigns encouraged people to recognize early warning signs, controlling finances, monitoring movements, emotional manipulation. Within months of the law taking effect, dozens of coercive control charges were already being laid in Queensland courts, demonstrating how widespread the behavior had been, and how rarely it had previously been addressed. What once went unnamed, now had consequences. Life continued, gently, quietly, beside remembrance. Across Australia, Hannah Clarke's story began appearing in classrooms, police training sessions, and national discussions about respectful relationships. Her name became synonymous not only with tragedy, but with change. Advocacy did not stop with legislation. Awareness campaigns travelled across Queensland, carrying messages about coercive control into rural communities where isolation often increases risk. The goal was prevention, reaching people before violence escalates. Because experts agree on one difficult truth: domestic violence rarely begins with physical harm. It begins with patterns that are easy to excuse, easy to minimize, easy to miss, until they are not. The advocacy work of Hannah's parents was later formally recognized across Australia for its contribution to domestic violence reform and public awareness. Their grief had become a catalyst for national change. A private loss transformed into public protection. And through that work, countless conversations began, between partners, families, friends, and communities. Conversations that may never be measured, but may already have saved lives. If this story has taught us anything, it is that prevention begins with awareness, with listening, with speaking up, with refusing to dismiss control as love. Because behind statistics are real people, real families, real futures. Hannah Clarke's story does not ask for sympathy. It asks for attention. It asks for understanding. And it asks every listener one final question. What will you notice the next time something doesn't feel right?